In her childhood, she made a promise with the innocence of someone who doesn't understand time, but feels destiny. Years later, she returns determined, knocking on the door of a man who had forgotten how to live. He didn't expect a memory from the past to shake the foundations of his solitude. But there, between silences and memories, the possibility of a new beginning was born. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Continuing. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the Hartford estate, casting golden streaks across the mahogany floors that had witnessed decades of prosperity. Outside, the manicured gardens of Greenwich, Connecticut, stretched toward the horizon, a testament to old money and careful cultivation. But inside the main study, 10-year-old Emily Morrison stood barefoot on the Persian rug, her simple cotton dress wrinkled from the journey, her dark eyes fixed on the man behind the desk with an intensity that seemed far beyond her years. Jonathan Hartford was 32 then, already a legend in real estate development circles. His empire had been built from nothing, each building, each project, a calculated risk. That had paid off spectacularly. He wore success like a tailored suit, comfortable and commanding. That morning he had closed a deal that would expand his holdings into Manhattan. By all measures he was untouchable. Yet this child, daughter of his groundskeeper, had somehow slipped past his assistant, past the protocols, past every barrier that separated men like him from the ordinary world. She stood there, small hands clasped in front of her, and spoke with a clarity that froze him mid-signature. "I'm going to marry you when I grow up, Mr. Hartford, I promise." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jonathan looked up, pen suspended, searching for the joke, the coaching, the adult manipulation behind such an absurd declaration. He found none. Only conviction, pure and unshakable, burning in a child's gaze. "Emily," he said carefully, the way one might address a confused visitor, "that's a very unusual thing to say. Does your father know you're here?" "He doesn't need to know everything," she replied, chin lifting slightly. "Some promises are between two people. I'll come back when I'm grown, you'll see." Before he could respond, she turned and walked out, leaving him alone with a bewildered smile and a story he would tell at dinner parties for weeks afterward. The eccentric groundskeeper's daughter who proposed marriage. Charming, absurd, forgettable. Except Jonathan Hartford never quite forgot. Life had a way of honoring some promises and destroying others. Within 2 years of that strange encounter, Jonathan married Victoria Ashford, a socialite whose family pedigree matched his ambition. Their wedding was featured in the New York Times society pages. The ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral drew 500 guests. Everything gleamed with possibility. They were happy. Genuinely, unexpectedly happy. Victoria brought warmth to the cold precision of his business world. She filled the mansion with music, with laughter, with plans for the future. When she became pregnant, Jonathan felt something shift inside him, a softening he had never permitted himself before. He commissioned a nursery, read parenting books in secret, imagined teaching his child everything he knew about building empires from dreams. Then, in one devastating moment that October, everything shattered. Victoria's delivery went terribly wrong. The complications were sudden, catastrophic, impossible to reverse. When the hospital called him that night, Jonathan Hartford learned that he had lost both his wife and his son within hours of each other. The future he had imagined simply ceased to exist. The man who walked out of Greenwich Memorial Hospital was fundamentally different from the one who had entered. Something had broken inside him that no amount of money or power could repair. He returned to the mansion and methodically began erasing evidence of joy. The nursery was locked and never opened. Victoria's piano was draped in cloth. Her gardens were maintained by staff, but never again walked by him. He threw himself into work with a ferocity that alarmed even his most competitive peers. Hartford developments expanded aggressively into Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago. Buildings rose bearing his name, monuments to ambition that felt nothing. Employees learned to communicate through memos. The mansion became a museum of wealth inhabited by a ghost. Years accumulated like dust. Jonathan attended galas because business required it, shook hands because deals demanded it, smiled because cameras expected it. But he had made a silent vow the night he lost everything. Never again would he allow himself to love. Love was risk, and risk meant devastation. Better to build walls no emotion could penetrate. He honored that vow religiously for nearly 11 years. Meanwhile, in a different corner of Greenwich, in a modest cottage near the estate's edge, Emily Morrison was growing up in the shadow of that childhood promise. Her father had stopped working for Hartford after that strange day, finding employment elsewhere to avoid awkwardness. But Emily never forgot. Even as she entered adolescence, then young womanhood, that moment in the study remained vivid, unshakable. Her parents, hard-working and traditional, had different dreams for their daughter. They scraped together money for her education, enrolled her in etiquette classes, ensured she learned French and piano and all the refinements that might elevate her beyond their station. Emily absorbed it all with grace, becoming polished and cultured, the kind of young woman who drew attention at church socials and community events. Suitors appeared. The banker's son from Stamford, the lawyer's nephew visiting from Boston, a young professor at Yale who wrote her poetry. Each time her parents encouraged her, seeing opportunities for security and status. Each time Emily politely declined. "There's someone else," she would say simply. "Someone else?" her mother would press, searching for names, for rational explanation. But Emily never elaborated. How could she explain that a promise made at 10 years old had carved itself so deeply into her soul that no other future seemed possible? It wasn't childish fantasy, it was knowing, the kind that arrives without explanation and refuses to leave. When she turned 21, Emily made a decision that horrified her parents. She would leave. She would return to the Hartford estate, find Jonathan Hartford, and honor the promise she had made 11 years earlier. "This is insane," her father said, pacing their small living room. "Emily, you haven't seen that man in over a decade. He doesn't remember you. He probably doesn't even know your name." "He remembers," Emily said quietly. "And even if he doesn't, I gave my word." Her mother tried different tactics: reason, emotion, fear. "What if he turns you away? What if he calls the police? You'll be humiliated, ruined." Emily packed her modest suitcase with careful hands. "Then I'll be humiliated with my integrity intact." There was no changing her mind. On a cool September morning, Emily Morrison left her parents' cottage carrying 2 suitcases and a heart full of certainty that terrified everyone who loved her. The taxi drove her through familiar streets that felt foreign now, past the iron gates she remembered from childhood, up the winding driveway where oaks stood like sentinels. The mansion loomed ahead, larger than memory, more imposing in its stone silence. She paid the driver and stood alone on the steps, looking up at windows that revealed nothing. Somewhere inside was the man she had promised herself to, the man who had no idea she was coming, the man whose life had been carved hollow by grief she had only recently learned about. Emily Morrison lifted her hand and knocked on the door, each strike of her knuckles against wood an echo of the promise she had carried across. 11 years through childhood, through adolescence, through every moment that had led her here. The door opened. A housekeeper appeared, elderly and suspicious, eyeing the young woman with the modest suitcases and determined expression. "Can I help you?" Emily took a breath, steadying herself against the weight of everything this moment contained. "Yes," she said clearly. "I'm here to see Jonathan Hartford. Tell him Emily Morrison has returned to keep her promise." The housekeeper, Mrs. Margaret Chen, had worked for Jonathan Hartford for 8 years. In that time she had learned to recognize the patterns of his isolation, the careful distance he maintained from anything resembling genuine human connection. She had watched business associates arrive and depart, seen countless professionals shuffle through the mansion on matters of finance and development, but never, not once, had a young woman appeared at the door claiming to keep a promise. "Wait here," Mrs. Chen said, skepticism evident in every syllable. She disappeared into the depths of the mansion, leaving Emily standing in the marble foyer where crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light and threw it in fractured patterns across walls that seemed to absorb warmth rather than reflect it. Emily set down her suitcases and waited. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her expression remained calm. She had prepared for this moment through countless sleepless nights, rehearsing words that now seemed inadequate. What do you say to someone who has forgotten you exist? How do you honor a promise to someone who has spent years learning not to feel? Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Deep, measured, belonging to someone who had long ago stopped hurrying for anything. Then he appeared. Jonathan Hartford, at 43, was both exactly as Emily remembered and completely transformed. The sharp intelligence in his eyes remained, the commanding presence that had impressed her child self, but there was a hardness now, a distance that sat on his shoulders like invisible armor. His dark hair was touched with grey at the temples. Fine lines marked the corners of his eyes, not from laughter, but from years of carefully controlled expression. He wore a tailored charcoal suit even though it was Saturday, as if the formality was a shield against casual connection. He stopped several feet away, studying her with the analytical gaze of someone assessing a business proposition. "Mrs. Chen says you claim to know me." Emily met his eyes steadily. "I do know you, Mr. Hartford, though I imagine you don't remember me. I was 10 years old when I last stood in your study. My father was your groundskeeper then." Something flickered across his face, too quick to identify. "Morrison. Yes, I remember your father." He paused, searching her features with growing recognition. "You're the girl who promised to come back," Emily finished quietly. "I told you I would return when I grew up. To marry you." The words landed between them like stones dropped into still water. Jonathan's expression shifted through several emotions too complex to name before settling into something that looked like disbelief tempered with irritation. "That was 11 years ago. A child's game." "It wasn't a game to me," Emily said. "I made a promise. I keep my promises." Jonathan exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple as if this conversation was triggering a headache. "Miss Morrison, I appreciate whatever sentiment drove you here, but this is absurd. You don't know me. You knew a man who existed more than a decade ago. People change, circumstances change, life—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "Life changes everything." "I know about your wife," Emily said softly. "And your son. I'm sorry for your loss." The temperature in the foyer seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jonathan's expression went completely blank, the way it did when he was negotiating deals he had no intention of losing. "Then you understand why this conversation is over. I'll have Mrs. Chen call you a taxi." He turned to leave. "Mr. Hartford," Emily's voice stopped him. Not loud, but carrying a quiet strength that made him pause despite himself. "I didn't come here expecting you to fall in love with me. I didn't come here with delusions of romance or fairy tales. I came here because I made a promise, and because I believe that some promises are worth keeping even when they seem impossible. I'm asking you for a chance. Let me stay, just for a short while. If you still want me to leave after that, I'll go. But please don't send me away without at least trying." Jonathan turned back slowly, studying her with new intensity. She stood there in her simple dress, no jewelry, no makeup beyond what was natural, holding herself with a dignity that seemed older than her 21 years. There was something in her eyes, that same unwavering certainty he remembered from the child who had invaded his study. Against every instinct he had cultivated over years of emotional lockdown, he found himself saying, "1 week. You can stay 1 week. There's a guest wing on the east side. Mrs. Chen will show you. After 7 days this ends." Emily's face transformed with a smile so genuine it actually hurt to witness. "Thank you, Mr. Hartford. You won't regret this." "I already do," he muttered, but he gestured for Mrs. Chen to proceed. The housekeeper, clearly bewildered but too professional to comment, led Emily upstairs. Jonathan watched them go, then returned to his study where he poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, despite it being barely 3 in the afternoon. He stared out the window at the gardens Victoria had once loved, trying to understand what insanity had possessed him to allow this stranger into his carefully controlled world. The first few days were painfully awkward. Emily moved through the mansion like a ghost, trying to prove she was real. She ate breakfast alone in the kitchen with Mrs. Chen, who gradually warmed to her presence. She spent afternoons reading in the library, careful not to disturb Jonathan's work schedule. She asked nothing of anyone, made no demands, simply existed in the spaces between his isolation. But slowly, imperceptibly, things began to shift. Mrs. Chen mentioned that Emily had helped her prepare dinner one evening, and that the kitchen smelled like her grandmother's recipes for the first time in years. Thomas, the estate manager, reported that Emily had spent an hour talking with the gardening staff about the roses, asking questions about their care with genuine interest. The driver, usually silent and invisible, mentioned that she had thanked him 3 times for a simple trip to town and asked about his daughter's college plans. Jonathan heard these reports and felt nothing, or told himself he felt nothing. Then, on the 4th evening, he came home late from a brutal negotiation in Manhattan. The mansion was dark except for soft light coming from the library. He intended to walk past, to maintain the boundaries he had established. But something made him pause at the doorway. Emily sat curled in Victoria's favorite chair, the one by the window that caught the moonlight. She was reading, completely absorbed, unaware of his presence. The scene was so reminiscent of evenings past that Jonathan felt something crack in the careful walls he had built. She looked up, startled to find him watching. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you come in. I can leave if you need the library." "No," Jonathan heard himself say. "Stay." He poured himself a drink, then, surprising himself, poured a glass of wine and offered it to her. Emily accepted with a quiet, "Thank you." They sat in silence for several minutes, the kind of silence that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. "Why did you really come here?" Jonathan asked finally. Emily considered the question carefully. "Because I believe in keeping promises, because I believe that some connections transcend time and logic, and because—" She paused, choosing words with care. "Because I think you've been alone long enough." Jonathan laughed, but it was hollow. "You think you can fix me, save me from myself?" "No," Emily said simply. "I think you can fix yourself. I just think you might do it better if you remembered what it feels like to let someone care. If you were in Emily's place, would you have returned to keep a childhood promise, or would you have let it go? Tell us in the comments." The week ended. Jonathan never mentioned it. Emily never packed. Somehow, without either of them acknowledging it, she simply stayed. Mrs. Chen prepared an extra plate at dinner. Thomas included her in household schedules. The staff began referring to her as if she had always been there. And Jonathan Hartford, the man who had sworn never to feel again, found himself looking forward to the sound of her footsteps in the hall. 3 months passed like water finding new channels through ancient stone. The mansion, for so long a mausoleum of memories, began to breathe again. It started with small things. Emily convinced Mrs. Chen to open the curtains in the main sitting room, letting natural light flood spaces that had lived in perpetual twilight. She asked Thomas about the gardens, and soon the flower beds Victoria had planted were being restored rather than merely maintained. The piano remained covered, but sometimes in the evenings, Emily would hum softly while reading, and the house remembered what music sounded like. Jonathan told himself he was tolerating her presence out of curiosity, nothing more. She was a peculiar house guest, someone who asked for nothing, yet somehow made herself essential. She never pushed him to talk about Victoria or his son. She never tried to occupy spaces that weren't offered, but she was present, reliably and gently present, in ways that made his isolation feel less like protection and more like imprisonment. They fell into a rhythm. Breakfast together on weekdays before he left for the office, usually silent but companionable. Dinner several times a week, where Emily would share stories about the town, about people she had met, bringing the world into his fortress without demanding he engage with it directly. Sometimes they would sit in the library reading separate books, existing in parallel solitudes that felt less lonely than being alone. The staff noticed everything. Mrs. Chen told the gardeners that Mr. Hartford had laughed, actually laughed, at something Miss Morrison said about a documentary she had watched. Thomas mentioned to the driver that the boss had started coming home earlier, no longer working until midnight as he had for years. The whole household held its breath, hoping this fragile thaw would continue. Then Greenwich Society noticed. Amanda Blackwell was the first to comment. She appeared at a charity luncheon where Emily had accompanied Mrs. Chen to help with setup, her diamond earrings catching light like weapons. Amanda had attended Jonathan and Victoria's wedding, had been present at every important Hartford social event, and considered herself a guardian of his wife's memory. "You must be the Morrison girl," Amanda said, her voice carrying across the room with calculated volume. "The groundskeeper's daughter. How enterprising of you to establish yourself in the Hartford household." Emily, arranging flowers at a table, straightened but didn't flinch. "Mrs. Blackwell, it's nice to meet you." "Is it?" Amanda's smile was surgical. "I'm sure it is. Landing in that mansion must feel like quite the accomplishment for someone of your background. Tell me, did you plan this since you were a child, or was it a more recent inspiration?" Several women nearby pretended not to listen while hanging on every word. Emily could feel their judgment, their assumptions crystallizing into gossip that would spread through Greenwich like wildfire. "I'm staying as a guest of Mr. Hartford," Emily said calmly. "Nothing more, nothing less." "How convenient," Amanda replied. "A guest who's been there for months. Victoria must be spinning in her grave, watching some opportunistic girl move into her home, use her furniture, probably setting her sights on her husband's fortune." The words landed like slaps. Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "Mrs. Blackwell, I understand you cared for Mrs. Hartford, but you don't know me and you don't know why I'm there." "Oh, I know exactly why you're there, dear." Amanda's voice dripped with condescension. "I've seen dozens like you. Pretty faces with empty pockets, thinking they can cry their way into wealth. Jonathan Hartford is vulnerable right now, and you're taking advantage of a grieving man. It's shameful." Mrs. Chen stepped forward then, her small frame radiating unexpected authority. "That's enough, Mrs. Blackwell. Miss Morrison has been nothing but respectful. Perhaps you should worry about your own household before casting stones at others." Amanda's expression turned venomous, but she knew when she was outmatched. She swept away, leaving a wake of whispered speculation. The encounter shook Emily more than she wanted to admit. That evening she was quieter than usual at dinner. Jonathan noticed immediately. "Something happened today," he said. It wasn't a question. Emily hesitated, then shared the encounter with Amanda Blackwell, though she softened the harshest words. Jonathan's expression darkened with each sentence. "Amanda has always been a vicious gossip," he said flatly. "Don't let her poison get under your skin." "It's not just her, though, is it?" Emily said quietly. "The whole town is talking. About me, about us, about what I'm doing here. They think I'm after your money, that I'm some kind of gold digger taking advantage of your grief." Jonathan set down his fork. "And do you care what they think?" "I care that it might hurt you," Emily said. "I care that people might see you as weak or foolish. I never wanted that." Something shifted in Jonathan's expression. He reached across the table, and for the first time since she had arrived, he took her hand. The touch was electric, unexpected, loaded with months of unspoken connection. "Emily, listen to me. I stopped caring what Greenwich Society thought the day I buried my family. Their opinions are worth less than nothing. If you're asking whether I believe their accusations, the answer is no. I know why you're here. I've always known." "Do you?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan withdrew his hand slowly, as if the contact had revealed too much. "You're here because you made a promise and you're stubborn enough to keep it, even when it makes no logical sense, even when everyone thinks you're crazy. And you let me stay because—" He looked away, staring at the wine in his glass. "Because maybe I'm tired of making sense. Maybe I'm tired of being logical. Maybe for the first time in 11 years, I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped running from everything that might hurt me." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to fully examine. But Greenwich Society wasn't finished. Over the following weeks, the gossip intensified. Emily found herself the subject of whispered conversations at the market, pointed looks at church, carefully worded questions from acquaintances. Some were cruel, others simply curious. But all of it created pressure that built like steam in a sealed container. Then Jonathan's business rivals began to circle. Marcus Devereux, a competing developer who had lost 3 major contracts to Hartford in the past year, started spreading his own version of events. At a business dinner in Manhattan, he loudly wondered whether Jonathan's judgment had been compromised by his new companion. He suggested that Hartford developments might be vulnerable, that perhaps Jonathan's focus had shifted from business to personal entanglements. The rumors reached Jonathan's board of directors. Several called meetings to express concern. His attorney, Richard Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew and a trusted advisor, came to the mansion personally. "They're worried, Jonathan," Richard said bluntly. "Not about the girl herself, but about optics, about what this looks like to investors and clients. You've built your reputation on being unshakable, focused solely on business. Now you've got this young woman living here. No clear relationship, no explanation, and the speculation is getting ugly." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "My personal life is none of their concern." "In theory, no. In practice, everything is their concern when millions of dollars are involved. They want you to clarify the situation. Either make it official, whatever that means, or ask her to leave." That night, Jonathan didn't come to dinner. Emily ate alone, feeling the walls of the mansion pressing in. She knew what was happening. She could feel the weight of the world's expectations crushing the fragile space they had created. She found him later in the study, staring at papers he wasn't reading. She knocked softly on the doorframe. "You should leave," Jonathan said without looking up. "This was a mistake. I never should have let you stay." Emily's heart cracked, but she kept her voice steady. "Is that what you want, or what you think you should want? What difference does it make?" His voice was raw with frustration. "Look at what's happening, the gossip, the business pressure, the speculation. You didn't sign up for this. You made a childhood promise to someone who doesn't exist anymore. I'm not the man you met when you were 10 years old. That man died with his family." "You're right," Emily said, stepping into the room. "You're not the same man. You're someone who's survived unimaginable pain, someone who's learned to protect himself by keeping everyone at a distance. But you're also someone who still laughs at stupid documentaries, someone who leaves books on topics I mentioned wanting to learn about, someone who pretends not to notice when I open curtains but never closes them again." Jonathan finally looked at her, and the anguish in his eyes was devastating. "I can't do this, Emily. I can't let myself care and risk losing everything again. It almost destroyed me the first time." "I dunno," Emily said softly. "And I'm not asking you to make any promises you're not ready for, but running away from the possibility of pain means running away from the possibility of anything real. Is that really how you want to spend the rest of your life?" He stood, walking to the window, his back to her. The silence stretched so long Emily thought he wouldn't answer. "Leave, Emily," he finally said, his voice hollow. "Please, before this gets any worse." Emily felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. "If that's what you truly want, I'll go, but I need to hear you say it while looking at me. Tell me face to face that you want me to leave, and I will." Jonathan turned slowly, and what Emily saw in his expression broke her heart. Not coldness, not dismissal, but fear so profound it had turned him to stone. "I want you to leave," he said, each word costing him something vital. "I need you to leave." Emily nodded once, unable to trust her voice. She turned and walked out of the study, her footsteps echoing through halls that had briefly felt like home. Emily packed her suitcases that night with hands that trembled, despite her best efforts at composure. Mrs. Chen found her in the guest room, tears streaming silently down her face as she folded the simple dresses she had brought months ago. "Miss Emily," the housekeeper said, her own voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Emily whispered. "He asked me to leave. I have to respect that." Mrs. Chen sat on the bed, watching this young woman who had brought light back into a house that had forgotten what warmth felt like. "He's scared. That man has been running from his own heart for so long he doesn't remember how to stand still." "I know," Emily said, carefully placing her books in the suitcase. "But I can't force him to heal. I can't make him ready to live again. All I can do is honor what he's asking for, even though it's killing me." She finished packing in the early hours of morning, when the mansion was silent and the darkness felt Absolute. She left a note on the dresser, simple and direct. Thank you for letting me try. I hope you find peace. She called a taxi, arranged to stay with a friend in New Haven while she figured out her next steps, and stood in the foyer one last time, memorizing details she knew would haunt her dreams. The taxi arrived at dawn. Emily loaded her suitcases, her heart breaking with each step toward the door. She didn't look back. If she looked back, she might not have the strength to leave. Jonathan heard the taxi from his study, where he had spent the entire night staring at contracts he couldn't focus on. He heard Emily's footsteps, the sound of luggage being moved, the front door opening and closing. He sat frozen, telling himself this was right, this was necessary, this was the only way to protect them both from inevitable disaster. The house fell silent. Hours passed. Jonathan tried to work, tried to lose himself in the familiar rhythms of business that had sustained him through years of numbness. But the mansion felt different now. Not peaceful, not protected, empty, profoundly, devastatingly empty. Mrs. Chen brought him coffee around noon. She set it down harder than necessary. "She's gone," the housekeeper said, her tone carrying unmistakable judgment. "I know," Jonathan replied. Do you really know what you just threw away?" Mrs. Chen rarely spoke out of turn, but her loyalty to Jonathan had limits. "That girl loved you. Not your money, not your status. You, the broken, scared, stubborn man hiding in this mausoleum, and you sent her away because you were too afraid to accept it." "It was for the best," Jonathan said mechanically. "For whose best? Yours? Because you get to keep pretending you're protecting yourself by staying alone? Or hers, because she gets to live with the humiliation of being rejected after keeping a promise for 11 years? Mrs. Chen shook her head. "Victoria wouldn't have wanted this for you. She would have wanted you to live, to be happy, to let someone care about you." The mention of Victoria's name hit like a physical blow. Jonathan looked up at Mrs. Chen with raw pain in his eyes. "How dare you presume to know what Victoria would have wanted?" "I dare because someone needs to," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "Someone needs to tell you that honoring her memory doesn't mean dying alongside her. It doesn't mean locking yourself away from every possibility of joy. Victoria was full of life. She would be heartbroken to see what you've become." She left before Jonathan could respond, leaving him alone with accusations that burned because they rang true. The day stretched into evening. Jonathan walked through the mansion, noticing for the first time in months the small changes Emily had made. Fresh flowers in the hallway, books rearranged in the library by some logic only she understood, the scent of vanilla candles she preferred, evidence of her presence scattered through rooms like breadcrumbs, leading back to a warmth he had deliberately extinguished. He found himself in front of the locked nursery, the room he hadn't entered in over a decade. His hand rested on the doorknob, and for the first time since that terrible October night, he turned it. The room was exactly as it had been left. Crib assembled, walls painted soft blue, stuffed animals arranged on shelves, dreams frozen in time, preserved like insects in amber. Jonathan stood in the center of the room and felt something break inside him, not with pain, but with release. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the ghosts that had held him captive. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I've been stuck here afraid to move forward because it felt like betraying you. But I can't do this anymore. I can't keep dying because you're gone. I have to find a way to live." The words hung in the air, and Jonathan felt something shift. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but releasing, making space for grief to coexist with the possibility of future joy. He left the nursery and walked to his study, where he picked up the phone and called Richard Chen. "I need you to find Emily Morrison," he said without preamble. "I need an address, a phone number, wherever." She went. "Can you do that?" Richard was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure about this?" "No," Jonathan admitted. "But I'm done being sure. I'm done being safe. Just find her." It took 2 days. Emily had gone to New Haven, staying with a college friend while she looked for work. Richard provided an address. Jonathan didn't call ahead. He drove himself, refusing to let fear or second-guessing change his mind. The apartment was in a modest building near Yale campus. Jonathan stood outside the door, his heart hammering in a way business negotiations had never managed. He knocked. Emily opened the door, and her expression cycled through shock, confusion, and carefully guarded hope. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Seeing her pain, knowing he had caused it, felt like a knife between his ribs. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "what are you doing here?" "I made a mistake," he said, the words coming faster than he could organize them. "Sending you away was a mistake. I was terrified. I am terrified. The thought of caring about someone again, of opening myself up to the possibility of loss, it paralyzes me. But you know, what's worse? The certainty of being alone, the guarantee of never feeling anything real again. That's not protection. That's just another kind of death." Emily stood in the doorway, arms crossed, protecting herself. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I walked into the nursery for the first time in 11 years, and I realized I've been haunting my own life. I've been so afraid of dishonoring Victoria's memory that I forgot she would have wanted me to be happy. She would have wanted me to live, not just survive. And somehow, impossibly, you made me remember what living feels like." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "I can't be your salvation, Jonathan. I can't fix what's broken inside you. That's work only you can do." "I know," Jonathan said. "I'm not asking you to fix me. I'm asking you to let me try to build something new, not to replace what I lost, but to create something that honors both the past and the future. I'm asking you to give me another chance to be brave enough to accept what you've been offering all along." "And what is that?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible. "The possibility of not being alone," Jonathan said simply. "The possibility of building a life that includes joy without erasing grief. The possibility of keeping a promise that a 10-year-old girl made to a man who needed it more than he ever knew." Emily stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I kept my promise. I came back. I stayed. I tried to show you that you deserve to be cared for. But I can't do this if you're going to run away every time it gets hard. I can't invest my heart in someone who's going to send me away the moment the world applies pressure." "I know," Jonathan said, reaching for her hand carefully as if she might disappear. "And I can't promise I won't be scared. I can't promise this will be easy or that I won't sometimes want to retreat into old habits. But I promise I'll try. I promise I'll show up even when it's terrifying. I promise I'll choose to build something with you instead of hiding in the ruins of the past." Emily looked at their joined hands, then back at his face. "The gossip won't stop. The society judgment, the business pressure, all of it will still be there." "Let them talk," Jonathan said. "Let them think whatever they want. The only opinions that matter are yours and mine. And I think we could build something extraordinary if we're both willing to be brave." A slow smile broke across Emily's face, the first genuine one since she had left the mansion. "You're really terrible at romantic speeches, you know that?" Jonathan laughed, the sound rusty but real. "I'm out of practice." "We'll work on it," Emily said, stepping into his arms. They stood in the doorway of her small apartment, holding each other like survivors. Separate storms who had finally found solid ground. It wasn't the fairy tale ending Emily might have imagined at 10 years old. It was better. It was real, complicated, built on the foundation of loss and courage and the stubborn insistence that promises matter. 3 months later, Emily moved back into the Hartford mansion, not as a guest, but as someone building a future. They opened the nursery together and turned it into a library, filling it with books and light and new memories. The piano was uncovered, and Emily played while Jonathan worked in the adjacent study. The gardens bloomed under renewed attention. Greenwich society never fully accepted their unconventional beginning, but eventually the gossip faded into background noise. Hartford developments continued to thrive, with Jonathan slowly learning to balance ambition with presence. Emily started a non-profit focused on childhood literacy, working with underprivileged communities in Connecticut. They married quietly on a spring afternoon, with Mrs. Chen and Thomas as witnesses, in the same garden where Victoria had once planted roses. Jonathan spoke vows that acknowledged the past while embracing the future. Emily promised to be patient with his fears and fierce in her commitment. Their life together wasn't perfect. Jonathan still had moments where grief ambushed him, where he withdrew into old protective patterns. Emily had days where she doubted whether she had done the right thing, whether her childhood conviction had led her into something too complicated. But they learned to navigate the hard moments together, to give each other space while maintaining connection, to build a partnership based on honesty rather than illusion. The mansion transformed from a museum into a home. They hosted small dinners, supported local causes, created spaces where laughter was welcome alongside remembrance. Jonathan learned that loving again didn't erase what he had lost. It simply proved that the human heart has a remarkable capacity to hold multiple truths at once: grief and joy, past and future, loss and hope. And Emily Morrison Hartford, the girl who had made an impossible promise at 10 years old, discovered that some kinds of certainty are worth defending, even when the whole world calls you crazy. Some promises are worth keeping, even when they take 11 years and every ounce of courage you possess. Some love stories don't follow conventional patterns, but create their own truth through sheer force of will and unwavering faith. On quiet evenings, when they sat together in the library they had built from a nursery that never was, Jonathan would sometimes ask Emily if she ever regretted coming back. "Never," she would say simply. "Some promises are meant to be kept." And Jonathan, the man who had learned to live again, would take her hand and silently thank whatever force in the universe had sent a barefoot 10-year-old girl into his study with conviction burning in her eyes and a promise that would ultimately save them both. Dear listeners, we hope Jonathan and Emily's story touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of grief, courage, and the power of keeping promises, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what resonated with you most. Was it Emily's unwavering faith in her childhood promise? Jonathan's struggle to open his heart again after devastating loss? Or perhaps the reminder that love doesn't erase our past, but gives us the courage to build a future? Every day, we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest complexities of the human soul and the extraordinary power of commitment, patience, and hope. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode.